Welcome everybody to the webinar 5 Essential Principles of Psychosocial Interventions, a conversation with Stevan Hobfoll. My name is Cecilia Dinesen and I will be moderating the webinar today. The webinar is organized by the Red Cross and Red Crescent Research Network for Mental Health and Psychosocial Support, which is a network of practitioners from the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement and researchers from academic institutions that promote research on mental health and psychosocial support. The network is hosted by the IFRC Reference Center for Psychosocial Support, and you can read more about the network on our website www.pscenter.org. In 2007, a leading article was published by Stevan Hobfoll and a team of international experts. The authors synthesized available scientific evidence and identified 5 essential principles of psychosocial care to people affected by disasters and other traumatic events. In the 10 years following their publication, the 5 essential principles have been extremely influential among practitioners, researchers, and policymakers around the world. This webinar tries to understand how the 5 principles have been used in practice and research, and perhaps sometimes even misused. Are they useful and appropriate in measuring outcomes of psychosocial interventions? And what is next for research on mental health and psychosocial support today, more than 10 years after the principles were formulated? In this webinar, we have invited Stevan Hobfoll to revisit the 5 principles and reflect on their implications for practice and research on psychosocial support in the past 10 years. Stevan Hobfoll is a clinical psychologist at Rush Medical Center with over 30 years of experience working in mental health and an impressive publication list with over 300 journal articles and book chapters. We have also invited Leslie Snyder to reflect on these questions with us. Leslie Snyder is a trained psychiatrist and master in public health with more than 20 years experience, and she is the author of several key reports and guidelines, including the Psychological First Aid Guide for Field Workers published by the WHO. Leslie will use the case of psychological first aid to discuss the implications of the 5 principles for research and practice. There will be time for questions in the end. Please write your questions in the chat function throughout the webinar, and we'll try to address as many as possible in the Q&A session in the end. And now I would like to hand over the floor to Stevan Hobfoll. Stevan, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'll do my best. I could probably say right now, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because we have people from all over the world. It's morning here in Chicago. I do have my cup of coffee at my desk, and I'm in morning mode, so I hope I can jive with all your modes as well. We're going to be talking about the 5 principles and how they might or may not have been used, and how they, I believe, have been used and misused. So since people have different levels of familiarity with the principles, we'll go through them as we talk about each one and how it's been used. So first of all, to thank, there were lots of people involved in this international group. They really came from all over the world, each one with considerable depth and expertise, and also representing all kinds of world diversity, gender diversity, and other aspects of diversity, because we were trying not to have a single Western viewpoint that often the literature. I always add that anything I say that's intelligent, I've probably taken from one of my colleagues, but the mistakes in any aspect, you're welcome to attribute to me. So first of all, the five principles as they are is safety, calming, sense of self, and community efficacy, which might be considered two in one, connectedness, and hope. And these are achieved through individual, group, family, organizational, media, and political outreach and consultation. So that's a additional point within a point, that we're not talking about traditional therapy here by any means, nor are we talking about just a psychologist, psychiatrist, mental health worker in front of individuals. You might be acting through first aid workers or firefighters or the media itself or through political process. Most post-mass casualty interventions are ad hoc rather than strategic, and I think this has continued even with the five principles. But if we want to get it done right, the overall strategy should consider the overall five principles as the base. Planning then should follow a combination of the organic nature of the event, because every event does have its own signature, but set against the framework of the five principles. I would add here to make the point that the five principles can easily be crowded out by saying, well, I'm doing those five, but I've added these 2, 3, or 7 more, and that'll start to work against you because you won't be getting to these five base aspects that you need to be getting to. Timing and sequencing is also important. They can also place intervention out of balance, as we tend to front load the demands and overcrowd the overall intervention. And I believe this problem continues. I can think of when we had the terrorist attack and massacre perpetrated by a psychiatrist at Fort Hood, and we came into the community. They were just, the whole field of intervention was overcrowded, but not strategic. So we might have had even 30 people doing one aspect of it, but other aspects being left rather fallow. Strategizing implies that there be a directing group and they have representative of different disciplines and officials. And this usually, if done well, pre-thought and pre-organization before you're ever thinking about the disaster or terrorist attack. So being hooked up between the mental health professionals, with local hospitals, with first responders, with political figures, with clergy and spiritual leaders, and having at least some meetings in advance where people know how to connect to each other and have some general ideas of how they might proceed and coordinate their efforts. Staging is also necessary, which means being ready for the next anticipated stage of development. And if nothing is going on, that means being ready for some beginning point. We're often at the state where we don't even have people's phone numbers in our own organizations, let alone the contacts of the mayor's office, the governor, who's ever in charge of public safety, fire chiefs, etc. I think there have been great improvements here because many countries and organizations have done policy work, including the different international organizations, well, beginning with the American Psychological Association and the American Psychiatric Association, the European counterparts of those, the British counterparts of those, the European Union, and although I'm less particularly familiar, I've seen on websites with many nations and places around the world. So we've had a great deal of creation of background material, brochures, which shows that people have been talking to each other and at different aspects of the pre-planning process. Another point that's often missed is mental health workers, we often think of the world of appraisal, but I've made a career of making the point that appraisal takes the risk of denying reality. When someone experiences a personal tragedy, such as rape or domestic violence, or there is a regional or national tragedy, such as a flood or an earthquake or a terrorist attack, it's not the time to focus on appraisal, but to focus on the realities and to judge the realities of what's occurred. In this line, safety is a physical state in which the potential for harm is limited to the extent possible. So we can help this, you think of this as perhaps first responders, but for example, how you message these safety messages and how you get people to respond to them is often psychological and takes a lot of knowledge about what safety might mean. I'll give you just an example of this. If you're trying to get elderly people to put on gas masks, but many of them have breathing disorders, they're more at risk at putting on the gas mask than they are of not putting on the gas mask if they're unable to breathe with it. So getting proper instructions out. And another point within that is if you give the wrong instruction at any of these points, you lose trust. Traumas create an illusion of ongoing harm that needs to be addressed through media messaging and using grounding techniques. So here we have the reality and the psychological, and we often talk pressure cooker effect, where people perceive correctly reality, but then it is just a natural tendency to exaggerate that reality. So we begin messaging with honest messaging that does not deny the reality, but brings people away from, if you will, catastrophizing within the catastrophe. Cecile, by the way, are we hearing okay now?
Yes, the sound is fine.
Great. So mental health professionals continue to promote appraisal models which deny the key elements of people's reality. We are still pushing appraisal models that stress is only in your head. And that's easy to say if you're a middle-class individual with good housing and good protections and safe in your home, then often your mental health issues are appraisal-based. But if terrible things are happening to you, the terrible things are almost always accurately appraised, and we have to respect that. So we don't want to try to use reframing at this stage unless they are exaggerating and catastrophizing. Psychological messaging can help authorities bring people to safety. How people cope initially can greatly affect their safety, and how authorities communicate can aid safety or interfere with it, creating panic. For example, of heading to the site to find loved ones when the site is not yet secure. Here would be an example of coordination that you would want a combination of the psychological and working with first responders, is have a meeting place that is away from the site where people are promised there'll be a maximizing of correct information there and officials there informing them, which might be at a backup hospital, it might be at a community center, it might be at a church or mosque, but not at the site of the attack or the heart of the disaster. Classic errors of the past, for example with Katrina, are the assumption that those without resources can get to safety if told where to go. So you have to think of, do they have a pathway to make it to safety. And often when you're telling people to evacuate, you're telling people to evacuate who actually don't have the ability to evacuate. And then what about if they don't feel that they can guard their belongings if they evacuate? So these things have to be considered. More experienced organizations have become more savvy on backfilling resources and not assuming people without resources can engage. A simple example of this, complex example, but illustrative in a simple way, is when Jewish refugees from Ethiopia had to cross the Sudan to be rescued to Israel. The elders, the adults, realized that the elderly and young children could not make the trek, so they sent their adolescents across. They were the only ones with the resource of physical strength enough to make the trek. And so when Israeli authorities in the north of Sudan were waiting, they were surprised to find only adolescents by the thousands having been sent off, with the parents remaining home with their young children and elderly. So that's a poignant example of how you have to have the resources to make the moves towards safety that you might need. Psychological safety is often informational, though, as well, and it relies on accurate information, very difficult to backtrack once confidence is lost in this information. So it is much better to say we don't know than to give false information and to become just one more of the rumor mills. Those who have a history of poor safety, pre-mass casualty, will require exceptional convincing. And we have to remember that in many parts of the world, including Europe and the United States, many of the segments of the population that are most vulnerable don't have initial trust in police and politicians. So winning them over to listen may not be obvious, and this is also the case in many parts of the world. Those with poor material resources will have more tenuous linkage between actual and psychological safety. And sadly, we have had a wealth of experience in such areas as school shootings, and we are gaining on how to promote psychological safety where more experience now, unfortunately, due to all these attacks that have occurred here in the U.S. and again elsewhere. For calming, this is an area where probably mental health professionals feel more at home in work to limit anxiety and intense emotions. But the difference here is moving from individual effort, which still might occur with psychological first aid. But in terms of disasters, this is often working through media, radio shows, television, and getting experts on who might give instructions, for example, on a children's channel of how to calm children and to have a calming playtime that the children could do, or instructions for them on limiting them from adult news, which might be graphic. So we have to get comfortable using media resources and increasingly using things like cell phones and computer resources. Mental health professionals can help people accept deep emotions and help judge and triage dangerous emotional levels. So we're not going to expect people not to be extremely sad and even very scared. So we want to be able to signal to people, well, what would be an example of being so emotional that you should bring the person to the hospital or bring them to a center where you have a combination of mental health professionals and clergy. People tend to either overjudge this, so to move too quickly, or underjudge it because they're not trained in making a correct assessment. Even at our own hospitals, after attacks, we're often called by nurses because someone's crying. Well, crying is not necessarily the wrong thing to be doing if the person is still cognitively equipped to act, and especially when we might have very limited resources and unable to send a health or mental health professional to everyone that's crying. We're getting better at planning calm interventions, and there are many more published reports in different parts of the world using various traditional and non-traditional methods. It might be a sweat ceremony for a native band in Canada, and it might be a drum ceremony in another part of the world, and it might be a Buddhist meeting with meditation and chanting in another part of the world. And I don't begin to claim the expertise of all the ways that calming might be achieved around the world, but each of you are familiar with their own cultures and thinking in terms of group or media distribution of this. Calming is mainly accomplished for most target individuals through mass communication, internet, or large institutional settings. Even for primary first aid, the workers can easily become overwhelmed by the numbers of people needing care. And we've, around the world, made great gains on websites and apps, and there are new apps. There's apps for meditation, for yoga, for calming, for spiritual music, for spiritual prayer. And I'm quite sure these are available around the world, but in some of the least resourced places, that may be an area that, for continued growth, that would be necessary. Less is available in many refugee language, and lack of cell phones and computer access are obstacles. Also, we have to remember that cell phone communication collapses after many disasters quite quickly. So although you might assume that your cell phone's going to work, it might in actuality only work for 5 to 10 minutes after a mass casualty occurs due to overloading. There are also age-related challenges to this. Although the average 10-year-old can probably do it, that doesn't mean the average 60-year-old is able to access technology as easily, readily, or whether that medium, even if they could do it, which many can, whether that medium speaks to them. For the sense of self and communal efficacy, we're talking here about getting individuals, community members to act and moving away from expert acting. Expert is more in a director's role here. So efficacy is both a product of skills and resources, and the recognition and appraisal of these. The two go hand in hand. But said another way, you can't actually be incompetent at something and feel efficacious and at work, because in short order, that feeling of efficacy is going to dissolve because it's false. Intervention can move quickly to increase targeted efficacies and help people translate their efficacy to fit trauma demands. So Bandura talked about the fact that rather than thinking of general efficacy, you have a specific efficacy. So the efficacy to calm your child, to use a gas mask, to do storytelling with others. There's all kinds of specific efficacies, and these efficacies on one hand become more complex, but more obvious if you talk about a refugee camp. Then you need the efficacy to perhaps lead prayer, the efficacy to arrange cooking, the efficacy to start a school to involve children if it's prolonged. So you start talking about specific skills, resources, and bringing people together to enact them. And I would say that it's better for communities and individuals to enact an error and learn how to correct it than for the expert to just give a recipe to follow. We want to promote active coping, getting survivors involved in their own recovery. This is often done on the ground, but in other areas there is little actual empirical study of this. So what I mean by that is I think this often is what occurs, but we don't know about how it occurs and even accounts of how it might have been done poorly and backfired, etc., or done best. So we need more case studies. We're not going to get gold standard clinical trials here, but the more careful the trial, the better the information is going to be. Self-governance, governance and participation rather than formal treatment are the hallmark of self-efficacy. So getting the individuals involved in their own care is the main message there. The expert model often diminishes empowerment, and it's often hard for experts to give up this role of telling others what to do. Just as parents, it's hard for us to give up telling our children what they do. We want to do stage setting and facilitating and move more into consultant role rather than the person that does it for them. We want to expand communal and family efficacy, so getting both community leaders and community participants involved in caring for their community. This seems to be increasingly what the natural direction that places are taking as we look at reports from around the world. And there are changes in a background philosophy in trauma work that have helped guide this change. But again, as in all these things, we really lack even case reports, let alone good qualitative study, and again, not expecting case-controlled clinical trials, but there still can be clinical trials, perhaps not controlled ones, that follow a time series. We've done this at times where we've had one community where there has been good effort and another community just naturally hasn't, and then we've followed how these communities responded. We need more of these, if you will, dirty empirical studies. Facilitating connectedness, mental health professionals need to work with first responders, communication companies, media to promote connections. In some places, it's as simple as a message board, but in other places, as long as access to television and radio is sustained, it can be through the television, radio, or setting up computer chat rooms where information is shared on getting people reconnected. Remembering that often physical connection, although that's the gold standard that we want to do, it may be impossible, and also loved ones may be hundreds or even thousands of miles away. So for example, when we had a tsunami and we had many families back in Scandinavia who had members of their family vacationing in areas that were hit by the tsunami on the other side of the world, the need to connect, and that first time you might hear the voice of a loved one becomes critical for both sides' mental health. And then sadly also getting information on injuries and even death are critical. In this regard, those who are well-connected are the least of the problem. We have to identify isolates in the community and be helping them connect. Creating formal and informal networks and using the networks we already have to foster connectedness. We want to instruct parents and caregivers about how to foster connections. And again, this is work that can be done and should be done beforehand, and that you're ready to go on, because this is just something that you know is going to be necessary. Some places have this and ready to help people foster connections and how to foster connections and how to seek support. And but in many of our areas of the world, this is not, the pre-work has not been done on this. Kenny Astley and Norris talk about being aware of the post-honeymoon period of withdrawal of support. So initial support may go very well, but then on both professional and informal levels, support is often withdrawn. And again, to underscore, those in most need are likely to have the least support. There's great awareness of need to make and foster connections, I think, among people doing this kind of work. But I would add that the more you can do pre-work and have a guide and workbooks, etc., ready to go, the better off you're going to be. Social support is assumed to be an organic process, and it is when it works well, but it can be enhanced. So worksheets on steps of social support that guide individuals, guide as to what's okay, asking and what's not okay. So, for example, there's lots of research where you tell people that God is going to answer all prayers is about the worst thing you can tell someone when God's not coming to answer their prayers. It's just a platitude and then afterwards ignored. So having thought through and messaging others, which sometimes, as I'm sure everyone on this webinar knows, just listening and being there to listen, that the person who's grieving is not expecting you to talk and just wants you to listen, just be there, just hold their hand, just be present. Material under-resourced populations may feel afraid to burden their under-resourced networks, so although they want to connect, they are often reticent to ask. Haves have much more access to key formal support than the have-nots, and we have to keep that in mind. Support places may need to be created if physical spaces have been destroyed, so places to meet that are safe and welcoming may need to be set up. There are a few guidelines on creating and maintaining social support. There are some available, and even fewer of them have been tested. But at all points, we have to go with the best knowledge that we have. For research, clinical trials of all types and levels are necessary. Don't be afraid to do dirty trials. By dirty, I mean it's not randomized. You don't have a clear control group. The control group's not the same as the intervention group. Whatever tools you have, the more you can get empirical information, the better. But well done, non-biased, qualitative work is very helpful as well. The golden rule, randomized trials are not going to be the golden rule. We need real-time research. We need ongoing feedback. We have so many ways to share this in terms of the web and informational sources. Best through journals because they have wide dissemination, but that shouldn't be the only way that things are disseminated. We need to do research outside of the use of traditional therapy in our interventions and research on non-traditional applications. I mentioned, well, without assuming, but we have people here listening from many cultures and parts of the world, and even non-traditional within your own culture is going to be different from one culture to another. You need to think through these and be ready for applying them. Even in places I've worked, such as Israel and Palestine, you have what works for a religious community can be quite the opposite of what works for secular elements of the same community, even though they mix day-to-day work together and may even be parts of the same families. So I think now I'm turning over to Dr. Leslie Snyder. Is that correct, Cecile?
Yes, thank you very much, Stevan and Leslie. You can unmute yourself now. Leslie, are you with us? Leslie, we can't hear you now. Okay. So Leslie, we can't hear you. Can you try and speak?
If you give me back present until she comes on, if you give it to me, I can continue, and maybe we can begin with getting some questions at this point if we're having some technical problems for Leslie.
Yes, thank you, Stevan. We're just trying to figure out what the problem is. Okay, so we can start maybe until we get Leslie on the call again. Stevan, there was a question for you.
Yes.
From Anna working, who has worked for UNICEF in Jordan and doing a master dissertation on international social work. And the question goes, I'm working on finalizing my dissertation on self-care frameworks in emergency case study Syria, and I'm using this framework with others as a basis for intervention. I would like to ask if you think there are specific implications to implement such a framework in an emergency, not post-conflict, that is ongoing. In a place with very limited resources and MHPSS professionals, how can we translate this framework into specific intervention plans, activities?
Well, that's an everything question. I don't think that being a highly resourced community necessarily gives you advantage here. Really, for me, the perfect and, if you will, the easiest level of intervention would be a village that did not have electronic communication because it's going to be a smaller village. People know each other. They know the meeting places. They know their religious leaders. And each of these principles can follow that. There's some interesting papers in the United States where they talk about when you become wealthy, you move from sitting on your front steps and talking to your neighbors to moving to your large backyard and patio and being disconnected from your neighbors. So wealth tends to be associated around the world with greater privacy and isolation. I think each of these principles are well suited for working within any community at any level. And again, the more people know each other and are used to being connected, the better off you're going to be. So I would say the main resource that you really need is how connected are people on a day-to-day basis with their neighbors or perhaps coworkers, as opposed to the isolation of the modern urban environment.
Thank you, Stevan. I think now we have Leslie online. Leslie, can you just try and speak?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you.
Oh,
Welcome on
great.
the call.
Great, I'm glad this worked. Thanks so much, Cecile and Stevan, and hello, everybody. Stevan, it's really great to be able to do this with you, because you and I have had some conversations on this before. So I'd like to leave some time for us to have a dialogue and also for the interesting questions that are coming up. And I see some related to PFA. So I'm going to go a little bit quickly through these coming slides. So I hope I don't make you dizzy with that. But I've often heard about the Hobfoll Five, as we affectionately call them, and I just wanted to talk about the applications to PFA. And the psychological first aid that I'm referring to is the WHO publication that was put out in 2011. It's up to 24 languages, I'm happy to say. And for those who are not as familiar with PFA, essentially it's first-line psychosocial support for people affected by crisis events. And just like medical first aid, it's not going to be enough on its own. And immediately after the event, it's often family members, local people, neighbors, teachers, community members who are the first responders. And this is the definition of PFA from the WHO material: humane supportive practical assistance to fellow human beings. It's non-intrusive, it's practical. You help to assess needs and concerns, ask people what are their needs and concerns, help them to address basic needs, listen but don't pressure them to talk. You'll see the word calm there, so it's comforting and calming. The connection to information, services, social supports, and protecting people from further harm. So I think you're probably already seeing in these slides references to the five, but let's make those more explicit. So it's actually in the PFA guide, there is this passage that PFA involves factors that seem to be most helpful to people's long-term recovery: feeling safe, connected to others, calm and hopeful, so there's 4 of them in one, having access to supports, social, physical, and emotional, and being able to help themselves as individuals and communities. So the 5 are articulated in there. And then if we want to look at specifically where in the guidance you find it, it's pretty much all over the guidance, except for the word hope, which is not specifically mentioned. In the do's and don'ts for PFA, I think we tended more to emphasize realistic reassurance. But hope is, I hope, is sort of implied underneath everything that you do with PFA. Safety, it's very specific. It's within preparedness. It's within look about helping to try to keep the person safe as well as you can. I think that also resonates with Stevan's point that it's context specific. Calming is also mentioned specifically. Listen to people and help them feel calm. And there's a text box on how to help people feel calm. And it's also relevant with the good listening skills and how to be a good listener, your tone of voice, your body language. Connectedness is very strongly emphasized. This is in the links section, including social support, and mentioning that people who feel they had good social support after a crisis may cope better, according to the literature. And finally is efficacy. And there's a lot on efficacy within helping people regain control of their situations, cope with problems, helping them to understand what are their urgent needs and how they can best prioritize. We also mention it around adolescence being helpful, and in the do's and don'ts. Don't take away a person's strengths, rather acknowledge how they have helped themselves. And I would say also within information, not saying what we don't know, decreasing rumors. And in the contextualization, we do a lot more with contextualization in the PFA orientations than in the guidance itself. So these were some of the questions that I thought about and that I hope we can have a dialogue about. So maybe I'll just mention them here first and then ask Stevan if you'd like to respond to some of these. I'd like to point people to the resource at the bottom, which is the Pfa Five-Year Retrospective that we conducted. Church of Sweden was the funder for that. World Vision International provided guidance as well. And this was, it's quite an in-depth report that utilized a lot of different methods to see how PFA was actually being applied in the world and how it was perceived. And one thing that actually came from the retrospective, somebody said, well, PFA is based upon the Hobfoll 5. That's where it comes from. And I found that interesting because PFA actually well predates all of us. So it was really coined in the 1940s, 1950s, the term PFA. And it's been around for a very long time. So it's not new, and there are a lot of very nice guidelines out there, including the IFRC guidelines. So I'm just curious, when you see something like that, what is your perception, Stevan, of how the 5 were applied to PFA? Did we apply it in an appropriate way? And the second question would be that we don't really see PFA as an intervention. We see it as a set of skills or an approach to helping. And does this change how the 5 then are articulated or used by this approach, since it's not actually an intervention, but a skill set that various people use depending on what role they're playing in the crisis response? And then the third question is about developing realistic and useful outcomes for PFA. So this is a big challenge for a lot of people. I think people in the field now are probably resonating with this. And can the 5 be used as indicators for output or outcome measurement? So for example, after receiving PFA, does the person feel more hopeful? What I have heard from people is that this doesn't work well. And in fact, we've suggested others that might be more relevant. And we could talk about that in a little bit if there's time. But perhaps if you could just reflect on those, that would be great. And I think I have to stop presenting so you can go on. Okay.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So great. So yeah, I think first of all, I want to speak to hope because that's critical resource and area, and it's a perfect one to talk about the perceptual as opposed to the real. So to have hope, the feeling of hope, without actual reasonable objective hope is going to be crushed at some point. Optimism by itself only goes so far. So you have hope when there are resources made available to you and when you have connection to those resources, when you're informed about likely positive outcomes that are going to occur. And I think this is an area that we'd have to watch because it's so easy to get into promoting this false sense of hope. And any person or authority figure or parent that does that, it's going to dissolve and backfire on you. It's much better to have reasonable hope of the next steps. And that hope recalibrates all the time. So saying this very sadly, but hoping that your one child does survive when another child has been killed is where hope moves to at that point. And one can't lose hope there and lose efficacy, because there may be important things that you have to do to support the living child. So these are it's an important point to make there. The fact that these 5 principles fit the PFA and PFA, obviously, in many ways, I'm sure we could find biblical references, be it in the Torah or the Quran, to the 5 principles and to PFA, because in some ways these are basic wisdoms, and that we're trying to distill, and they become points that attract people across cultures because they are basic wisdoms.
Yes, thank you. And that point also is brought up in the retrospective in terms of what is appropriate for evaluation of the effectiveness of PFA. I think one respondent said, these are sort of basic principles about dignity, about ethical behavior, about sort of human compassion, and how much of that needs to be evaluated.
Yes, absolutely. And again, this is why moving away from an expert model, especially in under-resourced communities, and allowing individuals, families, and communities to organize and to be more of a consultant role as a professional to guide the effort, becomes, really the favored route.
Thank you. And could you speak also to using the 5 as outcome measures? Have you tried that, or have you seen it done?
Well, I think they are both process and outcome, because each of them speak to endpoints that you want to get to. You want to promote communal efficacy, and then you can test whether there is communal efficacy.
And would you have
want to promote self-efficacy, and you want to test that. Again, it's a different kind of work, but we did an intervention across 5 hospitals with nurses who felt overwhelmed, and in a sense we used for that intervention, we wanted to increase self and communal efficacy and also their social support. And so we had tasks that did that, and then we measured those outcomes, as well as, for that setting, burnout and engagement. So that's where each of these, each situation, each disaster or traumatic event has its own signature that you want to follow on. People, for example, might already be well connected, so there's not much reason to go there as much as to work on calming, for example.
Okay. It would be, it's interesting that you also talked about some of the tools you used, and it seems that it would be helpful for the humanitarian field to have some tools that could be rolled out in a crisis setting fairly easily around these 5 and using them as outcome measures.
Yes, I mean, years ago we took research on supportive communication and created workbooks on what people had judged in that culture community would be the wrong things to say. I gave the example of, God will support you, and again, maybe in some cultures that might be okay to say, but in for U.S. and European populations, people who received support found that to be a negative. So then we put together a guidebook from people's own responses of what was the positive, and did that as an intervention of here's what people like to hear and here's what they don't like to hear. The also reaching out for support and not feeling like you're overburdening others, because people said they wanted to help others, but on the other hand, they were reticent to ask for help. Well, the concept of people will appreciate that you've asked them may not be obvious to them. Giving positive feedback once you've gotten support. If you get support and then say and keep complaining and don't respond about how the support helped you, the supporters are going to stop giving you the support. So these kind of create a rule book that we were able to use and disseminate.
Thank you, Stevan. Let me just jump in here, and before we finish up, let me just pose some of the questions that were asked from the audience. There's one question from John from Australia who's asking what your reflections are on whether community members should be trained in PFA, and if there's what the risks may be involved in that. And there's also another question from Tamara in Canada. So we are really covering all the world here today, who's asking about your research and thoughts on youth and social support and resilience building. So these are obviously very broad questions, but if both of you maybe could reflect briefly on this, and then I think we'll have to wrap up after that. Thank you.
So Leslie, you want to answer the PFA one?
Yeah, sure. There's lots of great examples of training community members, and many of them are the best PFA helpers I've seen. So I would say yes, definitely. It's very good to train them. And that was the point of the guidance that was developed, is that really anybody can offer that type of support. So parents, teachers, community members, as well as mental health professionals.
Yeah.
And in terms of the youth also, I would say there's also good child-to-child PFA materials coming out. And I think where youth can be helpful, it's a great boon to resilience. Thanks. Steven, over to you.
Yeah, I think on answering the youth one, it's a different area, but it makes the example that Kelly in Milwaukee on sharing information on HIV and safe sex. He trained youth workers who were identified then as having an orange shirt, and he made sure he picked kids from the different cliques and social isolates in the training, and they became the information sharers and resource sharers. So likewise, in any of these efforts, I think there's two things there. One is you want to make sure you get to the kids that are more socially isolated, and include them, but also you can train up the kids who seem to be the most skilled, the most communicative, and it may be some computer nerd who's communicative more on the computer, and now she's involved where she might not have been. So the same principles of involvement and training, whether it's PFA or other efforts that you want to be doing, they could you're going to have kids in the high school who are already doing yoga. Kids that are more health conscious and into exercise, they can be used in different kinds of ways, and come up with their own ideas.
Thank you, Stevan. And I think this will be the last comment for today, as the clock has now turned 5 o'clock here in Copenhagen, Denmark, and we'll finish the webinar. I would like to thank both our presenters. Thank you, Stevan, for presenting your view on the 5 principles and their implications over the last 10 years. And thank you, Leslie, for sharing your reflections on how they've been applied in the case of PFA. And to those of you who can't see the chat function, I just want to mention that Leslie has highlighted that there will be a webinar coming out in June focusing on the PFA retrospective that Leslie has referred to. It will be organized by MHPSS.net. So please stay tuned and follow MHPSS.net for more information about this webinar.
And Cecilia, thank you for organizing. You've done a great effort. And perhaps in follow-up, I'd love to hear how many people we had and from where they were from, if we have that information.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I've been trying to follow. I think we've been around 75 people on the call, plus minus, and I think I've tried to note down. I know we have had people from Singapore, Ecuador, Geneva, Syria, Denmark, Canada, Australia. So we've been sort of Brazil as well. So I think we've been all over the world. I would really like to thank everyone for joining, and thank you for your questions, and thank you also for your patience, because we've had some technical blurbs, and I think that's just reality. We live that we try to improve every time, but I can assure you that we will make an online version available, and we'll probably share it next week, so that those of you who had some problems during the call will hopefully be able to access all the information there. Yeah, and I would also like to just highlight the research network of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. We focus on mental health and psychosocial support, and we love to have new members. So please check out our website at thepscenter.org under research network and get in contact with us. And then have a great day, night, evening, morning, wherever you are in the world. And thanks for calling in.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie.